The wind whispered softly through the towering evergreens, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The Cascades had always been a place of beauty and mysteria, stretch of rugged mountains and deep valleys, where the line between reality and legend often blurred. For hikers, campers, and nature lovers, it was a dream destination. But for some, it was the last place they were ever seen. Among the stories that echoed through these forests, one in particular still lingered in the minds of those who lived nearby: the disappearance of a young girl named Emily and her uncle, David. It happened 5 years ago, during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. They set out with smiles, a packed truck, and plans for fishing, roasting marshmallows, and enjoying the mountain air. But they never came back. Emily was only 9 years old at the time, bright-eyed, curious, and always full of energy. David, her uncle, was the kind of man who loved adventure, someone who could turn even a short walk into a grand expedition. Friends say they had an unshakable bond, the kind built through years of trust and laughter. When they told the family they were heading into the Cascades, no one thought twice. It was something they had done many times before. The weather was good, the skies were clear, and they knew the trails well. But by the end of that weekend, everything had changed. When they failed to return home, the family tried not to panic. They thought maybe they had decided to stay an extra night, maybe their phone batteries had died. But as more time passed with no word, worry took over. A search was launched almost immediately. Dozens of volunteers, search dogs, helicopters. Scanning from above, for days, teams combed the forest, calling their names, finding traces of their campsite, but nothing conclusive. The tent was discovered zipped shut, sleeping bags neatly rolled. The truck was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no clear footprints leading away. It was as if they had simply walked out of camp and vanished into the wilderness. Speculation grew quickly. It's believed they had gotten lost, perhaps injured and unable to make it back. Others whispered about hidden dangers in the mountain's steep cliffs, unstable ground, sudden weather changes. And then there were the stranger theories. People spoke of old mining tunnels hidden in the hills, of deep caves where the unprepared could disappear forever. Every possibility was explored, but with no new evidence, the case went cold. Eventually, the official search ended, and the Cascades swallowed their secret. Years passed. The forest grew a little thicker. The trails changed with the seasons, and for many, the story of Emily and David became just another unsolved mystery. But for their family, time did not heal the wound. Emily's parents kept a box of her belongings untouched. David's friends refused to believe he would simply vanish without a trace. Hikers still sometimes mentioned seeing strange things: odd lights at night, a truck engine in the distance, but nothing ever led anywhere solid. Then, one summer morning, 5 years later, an unexpected clue emerged from the most unlikely source. A base jumper, an experienced thrill-seeker named Mark, had decided to film his descent from one of the steep cliffs in the Cascades. Wearing a helmet camera, he leaped into the open air, the wind rushing past as he navigated the jagged rock faces and narrow ridges. The footage was breathtaking until, halfway down the cliff, something unusual caught his eye. At first, it seemed like just a pile of debris wedged into the mountainside. But as he got closer, the shape became clearer: a rusted old pickup truck. Its paint faded, its frame tilted dangerously over the edge. A green tarp flapped faintly in the wind. Mark didn't think much of it in the moment. The Cascades were full of abandoned vehicles left behind by accidents or misadventures. But later, reviewing the footage at home, he noticed the truck's make and color. It looked strikingly similar to the one David had driven the weekend he and Emily disappeared. The tarp, too, was odd. Who would cover a vehicle in such a remote spot? And why hadn't it been spotted before? The more he watched, the more uneasy he felt. He uploaded a short clip online, asking if anyone recognized the vehicle. Within hours, comments poured in from locals who remembered the case. Some swore it was the same truck. Others urged caution, suggesting the mountains didn't give up their secrets easily. The discovery reignited interest in the mystery. Search teams were once again being discussed, and questions resurfaced. How did the truck end up on that cliff? Was it driven there deliberately, or had it skidded off the road? And most importantly, could Emily and David still be out there, somewhere? The location was treacherous, almost unreachable without specialized gear. The very spot where the truck rested was narrow, surrounded by sheer drops and loose rock. Getting close enough to investigate would be risky, but for the family, it was. A chance they had been waiting for, a chance to finally find answers. As news of the footage spread, theories multiplied. Some pointed to the possibility of an accident, where the truck veered off an unmarked trail and became lodged in the cliff. Others wondered if they had been trying to escape something, driving recklessly to get away. A few went further, suggesting that someone else might have been involved, and the truck was hidden intentionally. Each idea carried its own chilling possibilities, but none provided a clear answer. All they had was the image of that truck, sitting in silence on a ledge where no one should be. The Cascades had a way of keeping their mysteries, and this one was no different. The forest still stood tall and unyielding, the rivers still carved their paths through the valleys, and the cliffs still loomed over the land like silent watchers. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of the ordinary world, lay the truth about what happened that weekend 5 years ago. Whether it was buried in the undergrowth, hidden in the shadows of the mountains, or clinging to the side of a cliff, it waited and touched, unanswered, and as the sun set behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows over the forest floor, the image of that lone truck lingered in everyone's minds. A relic of a vanished moment, a silent witness to a mystery that refused to fade. What the base jumper's camera had captured was more than just an abandoned vehicle. It was the beginning of a new search, one that might finally reveal the fate of Emily and David. But until someone dared to climb that cliff and look inside, the questions would remain. Somewhere between the earth and the sky, in the heart of the Cascades, the truth was waiting. And not everyone was sure they wanted to find it. The video clip of the base jumper's descent continued to spread, and with each new set of eyes that watched it, more pieces of the past seemed to come crawling back into the light. For many people in the small communities along the edge of the Cascades, the image of that truck wasn't just a curiosity, it was a painful reminder of a story that had never found its ending. In the days following Emily and David's disappearance, their faces had been on every telephone pole and community board. Local radio stations had aired urgent messages, urging anyone who had been hiking or camping in the area to come forward. Even strangers from neighboring towns had shown up to help in the search. But over time, the voices grew quieter, the posters faded in the rain, and the forest reclaimed its silence. David had been known for his love of the outdoors. Friends often described him as the kind of person who could navigate a trail without a map, someone who could find his bearings by the position of the sun or the smell of the air. He wasn't reckless, but he thrived on the unknown. Emily adored him for it. She was the only niece in the family, and David had made it his mission to give her adventures worth remembering. The weekend they vanished had been her summer break, a chance for them to spend time away from screens and noise, away from the city's concrete and glass. They'd planned to camp by a secluded lake he had discovered years before, a place he'd promised was like stepping into another world. When the search teams reached that lake, they found nothing unusual. No signs of damage, no overturned boats, no gear left behind. The fact that the tent had been zipped shut and the sleeping bags rolled so neatly was one of the strangest details. It didn't fit with the idea of a sudden accident. They had been forced to leave quickly. Why? Take the time to pack up. And if they had gone for a short walk, why hadn't they returned? Searchers also noted the absence of tire tracks leading away from the site. In the soft earth of the forest floor, tracks usually lingered, but here, it was as if the ground had been undisturbed for days. That made the truck's sudden appearance on the cliff, 5 years later, even harder to explain. Mark, the base jumper, found himself pulled into the mystery almost against his will. At first, he tried to ignore the online speculation, telling himself it was probably just an old abandoned vehicle that happened to look similar. But the more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. He replayed the moment from his helmet camera over and over, zooming in on the tarp, on the rust patterns along the truck's doors, on the faint reflection of sunlight off the windshield. He realized that from the air, he had been able to see the truck clearly, but from the trails below, it would have been nearly invisible, tucked away on a narrow ledge, hidden by the cliff face and trees. As interest in the case picked up again, old interviews and news reports resurfaced. One clip showed Emily's parents sitting in their living room, holding a framed photo of her in a pink cap and blue shirt, smiling the way only children can. Another showed the search coordinator explaining the terrain, how quickly weather could shift, how the Cascades were filled with drop-offs and concealed ravines. There were also unsettling fragments from hikers who had been in the area during the week they disappeared. One man remembered hearing an engine late at night, high up on the ridge where there were no roads. Another claimed he had seen a faint green light moving between the trees. But when he went to investigate, there was nothing there. Local rangers had their own theories, though few were willing to voice them publicly. Some believed David might have been chasing something, perhaps a rare animal sighting or a strange light in the distance. Others suspected he had taken a wrong turn, ending up on one of the old logging roads that no longer appeared on maps. These roads, often narrow and unstable, could crumble under the weight of a vehicle, leaving it stranded in near impossible locations. But there was still the question of the tarp. It looked too deliberate, as though someone had made an effort to conceal the truck from above. And if that was the case, who had done it, and why? Emily's best friend, now a teenager, posted on social media after seeing the video. She wrote about their last phone call, about how Emily had been excited to tell her all about the camping trip when she got back. Her words carried a raw mix of hope and sadness, reminding everyone that behind the mystery was a little girl who had been missing for half a decade. The post gained traction, bringing new attention to the case from people who had never heard of it before. Among the comments, a few stood out: messages from hikers claiming to have found odd scraps of metal or faded fabric in parts of the forest not far from where the truck was seen. None of it was confirmed, but each small detail added another layer to the puzzle. Reporters began reaching out to Mark for interviews, but he avoided most of them. He wasn't looking to be the center of a news story. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something important, something that might change how the case was understood. Late one night, he found himself scrolling through old satellite images of the area, looking for any sign of the truck in past years. If it had been there all along, why had no one noticed it before? But if it had appeared more recently, that raised even more questions. Was it possible the truck had been moved there after the disappearance? And if so, how would anyone even manage that on such dangerous terrain? Back in the small mountain town closest to the search area, the local diner became the unofficial meeting place for speculation. Residents swapped theories over coffee, some insisting it was just a tragic accident, others convinced there was more to the story. An elderly man who had lived in the Cascades his entire life claimed that certain parts of the mountains had a way of keeping things, holding on to them until the right moment. A few people rolled their eyes, but no one could deny the mountains had their own strange rhythm. Time seemed to work differently there. and things could disappear from sight without ever really leaving. The sheriff's department confirmed. They were reviewing the footage, but warned that accessing the truck would be dangerous. The ledge where it sat was unstable, with loose rock that could give way at any moment. Even experienced climbers would have to proceed with extreme caution. That didn't stop volunteers from offering to help, but officials were wary of sending anyone in without a clear plan. For now, the truck remained untouched, perched on its lonely ledge, while the forest around it went on as it always had, quiet, still, and indifferent. Every new discussion seemed to lead back to the same haunting questions. What happened to Emily and David that weekend? How did the truck end up in such an impossible place? And why, after all these years, had it been revealed in such a fleeting, almost accidental way? The more people thought about it, the less it felt like coincidence. Yet, without anyone actually reaching the truck, there was no way to know if it held answers or if it was just another piece of the Cascades' endless mystery. As night settled over the mountains, the truck sat in silence, its metal frame catching the last light of the fading sun. Somewhere in the shadows, beyond the reach of the trails and the searchlights, the truth still lingered. It was out there, waiting just beyond the edge of certainty. And for those who cared enough to keep looking, the question wasn't whether they would find it was whether they were ready for what they might uncover. The discovery of the truck had stirred something in everyone connected to the case. But as days passed without an official investigation on the ledge, frustration began to grow. Emily's parents were torn between desperation and fear-desperation, to finally get answers and fear of what those answers might be. Every time they looked at that still frame from the base jumper's video, they found themselves imagining what could be inside the vehicle. Was it empty? Just another dead end? Or could it hold something they had been searching for all these years? That uncertainty was unbearable, but so was the idea of disturbing a place that had stayed untouched for so long. Mark felt the weight of the whole thing pressing down on him. He had only gone to the Cascades that day to enjoy the thrill of a jump, not to uncover a ghost from someone else's past. Yet he couldn't shake the sense of responsibility. It wasn't just about the truck anymore. It was about the ripple it had created. Every time he went online, there were new messages from strangers asking for details. New threads analyzing every pixel of the video, some even claiming to see shapes or shadows in the windows. He didn't believe in those theories, but the longer the truck sat out there in plain sight, the stranger it all felt. Meanwhile, a local climbing group began quietly discussing a plan to reach the ledge themselves. They weren't affiliated with law enforcement, but they knew the mountains better than anyone. Some of them had grown up here, scaling the cliffs long before safety harnesses and GPS devices became standard. They debated whether to make the attempt, partly because of the danger, but also because they knew that once the truth was found, the mystery would be gone. And for some, the mystery itself had become part of the story of the Cascades, something that made the place feel both beautiful and dangerous. One of the climbers, a woman named Rachel, had her own reason for wanting to try. She had been part of the original search 5 years earlier, combing the trails with a map and a flashlight, hoping for any sign of Emily and David. She still remembered the unease she felt near a certain ridge, the same one where the truck now rested. Something about the air there had seemed different, heavier, as if the forest was holding its breath. When she saw the base jumper's footage, it was like stepping back into that moment. And she couldn't ignore it at the same time. Rumors began circulating about an old road that once ran near the ledge. It hadn't appeared on maps in decades, but some of the older locals remembered an unmarked path used by logging trucks before the area was restricted. If David had found that road, maybe he had followed it, not realizing it ended abruptly at the cliff's edge. The idea fit with the accident theory, but it didn't explain the tarp, nor did it explain why there had been no signs of the truck during the original search. Even from the air, the sheriff's department faced pressure from the public, but they moved cautiously. They brought in experts to analyze the video, trying to determine whether the ledge could even support a rescue operation. The risk was high. Loose rock could send both the truck and anyone approaching it tumbling hundreds of feet. But behind the scenes, some deputies began revisiting old files, rereading witness statements from the days after Emily and David disappeared. One deputy found a report from a hiker who had claimed to see a truck matching David's parked on a narrow trail at sunset, a day before the family realized they were missing. At the time, it hadn't seemed important people left vehicles in odd places all the time. But now, paired with the footage, it felt like a clue they had overlooked. Emily's best friend, still active on social media, decided to organize a small awareness event. She gathered people at a viewpoint overlooking the Cascades, asking everyone to light candles as the sun went down. She didn't know if it would lead to answers, but she hoped it would keep the case alive in people's minds. Some brought old photos of the search. Others shared stories of camping trips in the same mountains. A few even spoke quietly about strange experiences, hearing voices where there was no one else around, or feeling watched in certain parts of the forest. Whether or not those things were connected to the disappearance, they added to the uneasy feeling that had always surrounded the case. Back in his own home, Mark started looking into the history of missing persons in the Cascades. He found more than he expected: stories of hikers who vanished without a trace, climbers whose gear was found but whose bodies were never recovered, even small aircraft that had gone down and were never located. It seemed the mountains had a way of swallowing things, making them part of the landscape. This didn't bring him any comfort. In fact, it made him realize that if the truck had been there for years, hidden in plain sight, there could be other things nearby that no one had ever found. Rachel, determined to act, began quietly preparing for a climb to the ledge. She didn't announce it publicly. She didn't want attention or interference, but she gathered the gear, studied the routes, and waited for the right weather. She reached out to a fellow climber who owed her a favor, someone skilled enough to make the descent without drawing notice. She told herself it was just to take a closer look, to confirm if the license plate matched David's. But deep down, she knew she was chasing something bigger, something she had been thinking about for 5 years. The longer the truck remained untouched, the stronger the tension grew in the community. People wanted answers, but they also feared them. Some worried that finding the truth would be worse than not knowing. Others feared that if they waited too long, the truck could slip from its perch entirely, taking any evidence with it. And through it all, the Cascades remained the same: quiet, watchful, and indifferent to the urgency of those below. One evening, as a storm rolled over the peaks, a bolt of lightning illuminated the cliffside for a split second. From a distant viewpoint, someone captured a blurry photograph of the ledge. The tarp on the truck appeared to have shifted slightly, revealing part of the cab. It was enough to send a fresh wave of speculation rippling through the town. Some claimed they could see something inside, a shape in the driver's seat. Others dismissed it as nothing more than shadows and rain. But for those who had been following the story closely, was another reminder that the truck was more than just a piece of rusting metal. It was the one solid link to a mystery that had never let go. And somewhere in those mountains, beyond the reach of easy explanations, the truth waited, as silent and immovable as the cliffs themselves. The ledge, the truck, the unanswered questions, they all stood there like a challenge, daring someone to finally step into the unknown. The days leading up to the next clear weather window felt like they stretched forever. The storm had passed, but the image of the tarp, shifted by wind and rain, had only made the tension worse. Rachel barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ledge, the truck clinging to it like it had no business being there, the jagged drop yawning below. She knew that if she didn't make her move soon, the elements might do it for her, sending the vehicle into the canyon and taking whatever secrets it held with it. Mark tried to focus on his own life, but every ping of a new message on his phone pulled him back into the mystery. People from all over the country were now following the story, dissecting every old photograph, every news clipping, every tiny piece of evidence. Some sent him theories that were so far-fetched he ignored them, but others hit too close to the details only the family and original searchers knew. It was unsettling how much strangers could connect dots that had sat untouched for years. He began to feel like whatever was in that truck wasn't just the family's secret anymore, belonged to anyone who had been pulled into the story in town. The air felt different. Conversations in the diner lowered to whispers whenever someone mentioned the Cascades. Old-timers who had once told their stories freely now grew cautious, as though speaking too much might invite something they didn't want to face. A few locals even admitted they'd gone to the edge of the cliffs over the years, trying to spot the ledge from different angles. But they had never seen it until the base jumpers video. That in itself raised an uneasy question. How had it remained invisible for so long? Rachel spent every spare hour on preparations. She and her climbing partner, Daniel, mapped the safest approach routes and double-checked their gear. They both knew there was nothing safe about this plan, but Daniel had been with her on harder climbs. They decided to go light, just the essentials. The less weight, the faster they could get in and out. She didn't tell anyone else the exact day, not even the sheriff's office. She justified it to herself by saying they could always report what they found after. In truth, she didn't want anyone trying to stop her. The night before their climb, Rachel drove out to a viewpoint that overlooked the ridge. The moonlight spilled across the forest, outlining the sharp edges of the peaks. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, the truck waited. She sat there for hours, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the pines. The Cascades had a way of making you feel small, like you were just a brief visitor in a place that didn't care if you stayed or went. Meanwhile, Emily's parents received an anonymous envelope in their mailbox. Inside was a single printed frame from the base jumpers footage, blown up, grainy, but unmistakably the truck. Across the bottom, in neat handwriting, were the words, "It's time to go look." There was no signature, no return address. They didn't know who had sent it, but it unsettled them deeply. It felt less like encouragement and more like a warning. Back at home, Mark couldn't shake the urge to see the truck again himself. The thought of Rachel going without any backup gnawed at him, even though she hadn't told him directly. He knew her well enough from the small climbing community to suspect she wouldn't sit on the sidelines. That night, he laid out his own gear and decided that if he saw an opening, he would follow. By the morning of the climb, the forest was unnervingly quiet. Rachel and Daniel moved through the undergrowth like shadows, careful not to draw attention. The air was cool, but the climb ahead was grueling. The ledge could only be reached from below, meaning they had to ascend sheer rock faces slick with moss, where one wrong step could be fatal. Every time Rachel glanced up, the cliff loomed above her, the sunlight just catching a glint of the truck's windshield as they got closer. The forest floor dropped away, replaced by raw stone and the thin whistle of wind sweeping up the cliffside. The higher they went, the more Rachel's pulse quickened. She could almost see details now: the rusted edges of the truck bed, the faint sag of its tires. The tarp was still there, but only barely, corners flapping against the metal with each gust. Halfway up, they stopped to rest on a narrow outcropping. The silence was so complete it made Rachel's ears ring. She looked down and saw the treetops swaying far below, their green crowns moving like a restless ocean. For a moment, she felt the weight of everything, the years of unanswered questions. The faces of Emily and David in the photos, the family still waiting for closure. Then Daniel tapped her shoulder. He pointed upward. The final stretch to the ledge was the most dangerous. The rock crumbled under their fingers in places, forcing them to test every hold before trusting it. The wind seemed stronger here, funneled by the shape of the cliff. Rachel's chest tightened as the truck came into full view. Its once white paint was streaked with dirt, its side mirror dangling by a single screw. The tarp, shredded along one edge, revealed a dark, gaping window. They were close enough now to see inside, almost, but from where they hung, the angle was wrong. Rachel knew they'd have to make the final push onto the ledge to see clearly. The air felt colder here, as though the cliff itself was holding its breath. She adjusted her grip, looked at Daniel, and they both nodded. The ledge was smaller than she expected, just wide enough for the truck's tires to rest. The vehicle leaned slightly toward the drop, and Rachel felt her stomach twist at the thought of how little it would take for it to slip. She edged closer, her boots scraping against the rock. Every sound seemed magnified: the creak of metal, the flap of the tarp, the low whistle of wind weaving through the canyon. Then, just as she reached for the tarp, a shadow moved inside the truck. It was so quick, she almost thought she imagined it a flicker of motion in the driver's seat. Daniel froze beside her, eyes locked on the window. Neither of them spoke. The wind picked up, rattling the truck in its place. Somewhere far below, a raven called out, its cry echoing up the cliff face. Rachel's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She inched forward, each step deliberate, her fingers closing around the edge of the tarp. The fabric was cold and damp. She glanced at Daniel, who gave the smallest nod, now, and then, with one sharp pull, she lifted the tarp. What she saw inside made her breath catch in her throat, but before she could focus on the details, the ledge beneath her gave a sudden, shuddering crack. The sound tore through the still air, louder than anything she'd ever heard on a climb. Dust rained down from the rock above, and the truck shifted forward with a groan of twisting metal. In that frozen instant, Rachel realized two things. Whatever was inside the truck, they were seconds away from losing it forever, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know the truth at all. Rachel's boots scraped against the loose stone as the ledge trembled again. Daniel lunged forward, grabbing her harness strap and yanking her back just enough to keep her from tipping toward the void. The truck's front tires inched closer to the edge, the sound of gravel cascading into the canyon below, echoing like distant rain. The wind whipped harder now, lifting strands of hair into her face as she fought to steady herself. She was shaking. But it wasn't just from the near fall. What she'd glimpsed inside the truck in that split second before the rock shifted was burned into her mind. There had been something in the passenger seat, not just debris, not an old sleeping bag or a pile of gear, something that looked deliberate. Daniel's eyes darted to hers. "We have to move," he said, but his voice carried a tension that told her he had seen it too. He didn't ask questions. They both knew they were balancing on the knife's edge between discovery and disaster. Rachel's instinct was to reach for the door, but the cliff groaned beneath them again, a deep, grinding sound that made her think of old timbers splitting. The thought of the truck dropping was terrifying, but now another fear wormed its way in. What if someone didn't want them to see what was inside? Far above, the sharp clink of loose rock bouncing down the cliff caught Rachel's attention. She looked up, squinting against the glare. For a moment, she thought it was just more debris loosened by the wind, but then she saw movement. A figure. Someone was on the ridge, standing almost directly above them. The silhouette was too far to identify, but it was definitely watching. She felt her chest tighten. It wasn't a hiker. No one else would be out here, this far from any trail. Daniel saw it too, his expression tightening. "We're not alone," he muttered. The figure didn't move closer, didn't call down, just stood there, still as stone, framed by the jagged edge of the sky. The presence alone shifted everything. Suddenly, this wasn't just about climbing to an old truck. This was about being seen while doing it. Maybe by someone who already knew what was inside. Rachel forced herself to look back at the vehicle. The tarp, now half ripped away, revealed more of the interior. The passenger seat was tilted back, and something metallic caught the light, glinting in a way that didn't belong to camping gear. A strange arrangement of straps and faded fabric sprawled across it, tangled like it had been left in a hurry or hidden. She wanted to reach for it, to pull it free and see it clearly, but the ledge shifted under her weight again. Above them, the figure stepped back out of sight. Rachel's pulse jumped. If they were trying to get down here, it meant they either wanted to help or they were coming to stop her. Either way, time was running out. Mark's voice suddenly crackled in her earpiece. She had forgotten she'd kept the radio on from earlier. "Rachel, don't panic, but I'm on the ridge. I saw someone else up here. They're moving fast, heading your way." Her breath caught. "It's not you." "No," Mark replied, his tone low and urgent. "Whoever it is, they were already here when I arrived." The realization hit her. Hard this wasn't chance. The moment the tarp had been disturbed by the storm, someone must have known it wouldn't stay hidden. Someone had been watching the truck long before they arrived. The grinding sound of rock returned, louder this time. The truck lurched forward a fraction, enough to make Daniel brace his legs against the cliff face. Rachel reached instinctively for the door handle, her gloves slipping on the rusted metal. It didn't budge. Either it was locked or fused shut from years of weather. She pounded it with her palm, the hollow thud echoing into the canyon. From somewhere above came the sound of shifting gravel footsteps. Fast ones. Whoever was up there was getting closer. The thought made her move quicker, tugging harder at the handle, feeling the sharp bite of panic creep in. Finally, with a screech of metal, the door gave a few inches butt before she could swing it open. The ledge cracked again, a deep fracture spidering out from beneath the truck's rear tire. Pebbles and dust poured into the air, and for one dizzy moment, she felt the whole cliff shudder beneath them. Daniel grabbed her arm. "If we stay any longer, we're going with it." But Rachel's eyes stayed locked on the narrow gap the door had opened. Through that space, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a small object hanging from the rear-view mirror. It was faded and weather-worn, but unmistakable. A child's pink baseball cap. She didn't have time to process it. Above them, a voice called out sharp, commanding, and far too close. She looked up, heart hammering, just in time to see the shadowed figure step onto the slope above the ledge. A coil of rope in one hand. And in that instant, Rachel knew the ledge wasn't the only thing ready to give way. Rachel's breath came fast as the figure above began descending, the rope scraping against the jagged rock. Daniel pulled her back from the truck, but her eyes kept going to that pink baseball cap swaying in the dark gap of the door. She couldn't leave it, not without knowing. The ledge groaned again, pebbles rattling down into the canyon. The sound of boots hitting the slope above sent a fresh wave of urgency through her. Whoever this was, they were seconds away from reaching them. She dropped to her knees, shoving her arm through the narrow opening. Rusted metal scraped her forearm, but her fingers brushed the cap's brim. She yanked it free, the old fabric damp from years of weather. As she held it in her hand, the color and size triggered a memory news articles. A missing child from years ago. That little girl had vanished in these very mountains, and the search had ended with no trace. Until now, "Rachel, we have to go," Daniel shouted, gripping her harness and pulling hard. She stumbled backward just as the truck's rear wheel tipped over the edge, the entire vehicle lurching forward with a violent crunch. The sound was deafening as it slid, metal shrieking against stone before it plunged into the canyon. The wind swallowed the final crash, leaving only silence and dust swirling in the air. The figure stopped just a few feet away from them now. In the dim light, Rachel finally saw their face. It was weathered, sunburned, and tight with desperation. "Give that to me," they demanded, pointing at the cap. Rachel stepped back, clutching it tighter. "Why? Who are you?" The stranger's gaze darted up the slope as if checking for someone else. "You don't understand. If you take that down the mountain, you're not the only one they'll come after. They've been watching this place for years." Before Rachel could respond, a second figure appeared at the ridge above Mark, breathing hard, a flare gun in his hand. Without a word, he fired it into the sky, the red light bursting over the canyon. The stranger flinched, then turned and sprinted along the slope, disappearing into the rocks as quickly as they'd come. Daniel steadied Rachel as Mark scrambled down to them. "The authorities are on their way," he said. "That flare wasn't just for light, it was a signal. They've been waiting for proof before moving in." Rachel opened her hand and looked at the cap again, in the faint glow from the flare. She noticed something she hadn't before. Stitched inside the brim, hidden in the lining, was a small folded scrap of paper. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it free. The paper was worn and fragile, but the ink was still clear. It wasn't just a note, it was coordinates. And when she glanced at Daniel, she could see the same realization dawning on him. The truck wasn't the end of the mystery. It was the beginning of something even bigger. Somewhere far below in the darkness, the echoes of the crash faded, but Rachel knew the real impact was only just starting. Rachel stood in the thin mountain air, still holding the pink cap as the last flicker of the flare's glow died against the dark ridgeline. The paper in her hand felt heavier than it should have. Coordinates that seemed to hum with unanswered questions. Daniel brushed the dust off his jacket, his eyes scanning the surrounding slopes like he was expecting the stranger to come back. Mark had already grabbed his radio, calling in the location and telling the approaching rescue team to bring more than just medics. They waited in a silence, broken only by the wind rushing up the canyon. Rachel kept thinking of that little girl from the news all those years ago, and how her disappearance had never made sense. No tracks, no witnesses. Just a missing child and an uncle who vanished the same night while camping in the Cascades. The truck they'd found, twisted metal and shattered glass, suddenly tied every piece together. Whoever had been in it hadn't just been lost. Someone had made sure they were never found. When the rescue crew finally arrived, their floodlights painted the cliff in cold white beams. The team moved with practiced speed, securing the area while others lowered themselves toward the canyon floor where the truck had fallen. Rachel passed the cap to a woman in a bright jacket who promised to treat it like evidence. The coordinates were sealed in a plastic bag, and Rachel watched them disappear into the hands of an investigator who already looked like he knew. They meant trouble for someone. The stranger who'd tried to take the cap was nowhere to be seen. Searchers swept the nearby ridges, but it was like he'd melted into the rocks. Rachel couldn't shake his warning, though. They've been watching this place for years. The words echoed in her head as she sat on a boulder, sipping from the water bottle someone had handed her. Who were they? And why guard a place like this? Hours passed before the radio crackled with news from the canyon floor. They'd found 2 sets of remains, one matching the little girl's size, the other an adult male. Both had been trapped under the wreckage, hidden from view unless you knew exactly where to look. Rachel's chest tightened as she realized. The adult was almost certainly the missing uncle. The questions only multiplied. If they died the night they disappeared, how had their truck stayed undiscovered for so long in a place that base jumpers, hikers, and rangers passed by every year? Mark crouched beside her, his face lit by the glow of the portable lights. "They'll run DNA to confirm, but it's them," he said quietly. "I think those coordinates, They point to where the rest of it is. Whatever they were carrying. Whatever someone didn't want found. Rachel stared at the scrap of paper still sealed in the evidence bag. "Do you think it's worth going after?" she asked. He gave her a look she couldn't quite read. "If we don't, someone else will. And next time, maybe they won't leave you alive to tell the story." The ride down the mountain was long and silent. The rescue convoy's headlights cut through the dense trees, the road winding in endless switchbacks. Rachel kept replaying the moment she saw the cap, the stranger's eyes, the sudden weight of the coordinates. She'd come here chasing a strange blur caught on a base jumper's helmet camera, thinking maybe it would make for an interesting documentary clip. She never expected to walk straight into a mystery that had haunted families for half a decade at the ranger station. The team split up. Some went to the evidence room, others filed reports. Mark disappeared into an office with two plainclothes investigators. Daniel sat beside her, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "Do you ever think," he said slowly, "that maybe some places don't want to be found?" Rachel almost laughed, but the sound stuck in her throat. "Places don't have a say," she replied. "People do." By morning, the story had already started to break. News vans lined the road outside. The station, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Reporters were shouting questions at anyone who stepped outside. Words like long lost and tragic discovery were on every broadcast. But Rachel knew the real story was still locked in those coordinates and in the shadowy network of people who had worked so hard to keep the truth buried. 2 days later, she sat across from Mark in a quiet diner. The pink cap now back in her possession after being cleared for release. The paper with the coordinates was still in police hands, but she'd memorized them. Mark stirred his coffee without drinking it. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" Rachel met his eyes. "Would you?" He didn't answer, and that was enough. A week after the rescue, Rachel hiked back into the Cascades, not to the same ledge, but to a point marked by those coordinates. Daniel had stayed behind, uneasy about going deeper into a mystery that had already nearly killed them. Mark was with her, carrying most of the gear. The air was colder here, the forest quieter, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The spot turned out to be a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of moss. Inside, the beam from her flashlight revealed a small pile of weathered crates, their metal corners rusted but still sturdy. She knelt, brushing away decades of dust until faded letters appeared, markings that didn't belong to any camping gear. Military codes. She glanced at Mark, who was already pulling out his phone to take pictures. They didn't open the crates. Some mysteries they both knew weren't theirs to solve alone. But as they marked the location for the authorities, Rachel realized that the stranger's warning hadn't been about superstition or local legends. It had been about what these mountains were hiding and the lengths some people would go to protect those secrets. Weeks later, back in the city, Rachel uploaded the final cut of her documentary. It wasn't just about a girl and her uncle who vanished camping in the Cascades. It was about how truth can hide in plain sight. Evidence can sit untouched for years because the right people never look, or because the wrong people make sure they don't. She ended the video with a simple shot of the pink cap on a wooden table, sunlight streaming through a window. No narration, no dramatic music, just silence and the weight of a story finally told. In the comments that poured in, viewers speculated wildly about the crates, the stranger, and what might still be hidden in those mountains. Rachel didn't answer most of them. Some truths she knew were better left for the right time and the right hands. But at night, when the city noise faded and her apartment was still, she'd find herself turning the cap over in her hands, feeling the rough stitches inside the brim. Somewhere out there, the rest of the story was waiting. And when the time came, she would be ready to follow it no matter where the coordinates led.